One of the ways that a system can be hard to change is that it gets us to hate each other instead of the system. And so it's of course natural to have anger, and the first stage of anger is usually wanting to figure out who to be angry at.
Do you have any comment on conflicts between the conflicts within the Intactivist movement as far as honoring the feelings of the perpetrators, regret parents, and honoring the feelings of the victims? Because there have been conflicts there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what you've noticed and what your thoughts are.
I feel like they're both legitimate perspectives. I feel like that men need to be able to fully feel the emotions they have around this issue, and regret parents need to be able to fully feel the emotions they have about this issue. And when you get into blame, that's when people's defenses come up. But if you've experienced this and you have anger, there's a desire to direct that anger at someone or something. And I think that greater healing for the people who it's affected, greater access to things that they can use to heal, things like the early life trauma therapy that you were mentioning earlier, would be hugely helpful for all of that. Part of the problem now is that there is no culturally accepted space to feel those feelings. If there's no space for it to come out, it'll come out in a space that it's not ideal for it to come out, right? And so I think that's part of the issue now, is that both of those groups have a really strong emotion that they need to process. Since there isn't really a clearly culturally defined space for either of them, sometimes they try to share the same space and clash with each other a bit. There's not a lot of really good services for men who feel grief or trauma around this issue who want to do healing work. And so is there a way that we could basically create a way to connect healers and psychologists and therapists who are comfortable working on this issue? Because one of the problems that men have is they'll go to their therapist and they'll say, I'm feeling some grief around this, and their therapist will be like, well, what do you mean? That's a normal thing, right? And I'm like, oh, well, great, I'm being gaslit by my therapist. This is awesome, right? And so if you can somehow connect, and this is something that Ryan talks about, the people who need that healing work with people who are able to give it, there's a huge possibility there. But I feel like there's probably 20 different ideas like that that haven't been tried, and 19 of them won't work, and one of them is going to be amazing. And we don't know what it is until we try. So that's my thought there. I feel like social change too is a bit like going bankrupt. It happens very slowly and then all at once.
Well, like I said, I think it's a systemic problem. So systems harm people in multiple different ways. And one of the ways that a system can be hard to change is that it gets us to hate each other instead of the system. And so it's of course natural to have anger. And the first stage of anger is usually wanting to figure out who to be angry at. And it takes a lot of effort to move that from like a very specific individual that one can like associate having been the agent of like injury to the system that coerced that person into becoming the agent of that injury. And so the idea of like separating the spaces where two people who have been hurt in different ways can process so they don't need to direct at each other is a very good choice. And there are a number of ways to do that, men's groups, parents groups, co-counseling, somatic experiencing, those are just a few. And so for people to find those spaces where there's groups and subcultures that are already aware of this, so you don't feel like you're being gaslit by your therapist, as someone put just a little while ago. I thought that was a brilliant way of putting it, because that's just adding insult to injury is really valuable. And then once some of that processing is done, recognizing the actual natural allyship between these groups of people who've been hurt in different ways to work together on the same issue.
I think that's really great. I feel like the conflict, at least in the film, is not necessarily between pro and anti, but between people who are willing to feel their feelings and people who aren't. And so that, getting them to actually feel those feelings is a really, really good idea. One of the things that Martin Luther King says in his book on activism, he talks about taking the approach and the mindset that the wider culture that you're a therapist and the wider culture is your patient, because only a mentally ill person would behave in a way towards people that these systems do.
Yeah, like look at take Brian Morris and Edgar Schoen from that film, right? If you watch them carefully, to me anyway, I guess I can't say what you would. For me, watching them carefully, and these are two people who are on the exact opposite end of this issue for me. They are my enemies, if you will, right? Like what they look like is really deeply wounded people who have basically lost touch with their humanity and their sympathy or empathy or something like that. Like they look like shells to me. And so I see them as deeply wounded, enough to be dangerous to other people, but I still don't think that just hurting them is like, a useful thing. As tempting as it might be just to be like, well, Brian Morris is an asshole, he's just a hurt person who's like, doesn't know how to like cope with whatever happened to him. I have no idea what it was. So trying to like have that empathy and act out of that empathy is a good move for yourself and then also strategically.
I'd add to that too, if there are people whose activism you don't like or disagree with, having empathy for them too. I think a lot of people, I've heard some questions about strategy, and in that I think there's an assumption that it's actually possible to rationally step back and look at this issue and decide what the best course of action is, and then get all of these wounded people together to move in that direction. And in reality, because of the systemic things we're talking about and because of this issue, you're going to have a lot of people working on it who feel wounded and sometimes act from that wounding. And so I don't expect that there's ever going to be a perfect group or a totally organized thing. I've never been a part of any project where everything was totally organized. So, I also, it's why it's hard for me to say like, that group of people, they're bad, they should stop doing that, because I sort of understand where they're coming from. I understand why looking at this, someone would get really angry and then try to enact that anger on someone they feel is responsible. It makes sense to me. It's not my approach, it's not what I want to do, but I understand it.